On September 1, 1983, in the icy darkness above the Sea of Japan, a series of mistakes, misunderstandings, and Cold War paranoia collided in one of the most explosive incidents of the 20th century. A tragedy that killed 269 innocent people aboard Korean Airlines Flight 007 and came terrifyingly close to igniting a nuclear confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union. This is a story of a civilian jetliner that accidentally strayed into one of the most heavily guarded skies on Earth, a Soviet air defense network convinced it was under attack, and world leaders on both sides who realized in the following hours that a single misinterpreted radar blip could have ended human civilization. KAL-007 was a routine commercial flight departing from New York's JFK Airport, scheduled to stop in Anchorage before continuing to Seoul. Among the passengers were families, students, businessmen, and even a sitting United States Congressman, Larry McDonald, a fierce anti-Soviet critic whose presence unknowingly added political fuel to an already dangerous situation. To the people aboard the Boeing 747, the night seemed ordinary, but to the Soviet Union, this same night was anything but peaceful. The USSR was on maximum alert. Weeks prior, U.S. reconnaissance flights had aggressively probed Soviet airspace in the Far East, testing radar coverage and response times. American RC-135 surveillance aircraft, white four-engine planes that resembled civilian 747s from certain angles, frequently operated near the Kamchatka Peninsula, a region containing some of the most secret missile sites in the Soviet Union. Inside Soviet command bunkers, the belief had taken root that the United States was preparing for a first strike. The psychological atmosphere inside the USSR was tense, fragile, and primed for disaster. As KAL-007 left Anchorage and headed southwest, a single navigational input error, just a few digits mistyped into the plane's inertial navigation system, sent the aircraft drifting off its intended path. Instead of following the designated corridor, the jet wandered relentlessly toward forbidden Soviet airspace. The pilots, unaware of the mistake, flew calmly through the night sky, trusting their instruments while hundreds of passengers slept in their seats. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, Soviet radar operators monitoring the Pacific region noticed something strange. A large aircraft approaching the restricted zone near Kamchatka, the same area the Soviets believed American spy planes targeted. In the tense mindset of 1983, Soviet officers were taught to assume the worst. Was this an RC-135? Was this the beginning of a U.S. intelligence operation? Or worse, a prelude to a nuclear strike? As KAL-007 crossed into Soviet territory near the Kamchatka Peninsula, Soviet air defense scrambled fighters to intercept. But the operation immediately stumbled. Communication lines failed. Radar tracking was inconsistent. Commanders argued over identification procedures. Soviet pilots, flying in darkness over remote ocean waters, struggled to visually identify the incoming aircraft. Several times, Soviet MiG-23s and Su-15s came close, so close that later analysis shows they passed beneath the Boeing 747. But cloud cover, darkness, and the plane's cruising altitude made visual recognition nearly impossible. The Soviets launched anti-aircraft missiles from ground bases, but they malfunctioned. The aircraft continued flying deeper into Soviet airspace as commanders debated what to do. For the next 2 hours, KAL-007 unknowingly triggered a cascade of escalating alarms inside multiple Soviet command posts. To the Americans monitoring the situation at NORAD, the events appeared equally frightening. U.S. electronic intelligence aircraft in the region detected Soviet fighters vectoring toward an unidentified target. Communications chatter among Soviet units spiked. American analysts feared the Soviets believed they were responding to an actual threat. In the background of all this was the chilling reality that both superpowers were conducting nuclear readiness exercises that same week. The timing could not have been worse. After failing to intercept over Kamchatka, the Soviets prepared for a second attempt as KAL-007 drifted towards Sakhalin Island, another military-sensitive region. The local Soviet commander, General Anatoly Kornikov, was furious. He ordered his pilots to destroy the intruder before it could escape Soviet airspace again. Moments later, two Su-15 interceptors screamed into the sky, racing to catch the unidentified aircraft. One of these pilots was Major Gennady Osipovich. He would later describe seeing blinking lights on the aircraft, lights he believed were decoys meant to confuse Soviet detection systems. He attempted to signal the jet with his lights and maneuvered beneath it to identify its silhouette, but the altitude, night conditions, and the Boeing's unexpected flight behavior made the situation impossible to interpret. Osipovich radioed back that the target did not respond. To him, this confirmed the worst. It was not a civilian aircraft, but a U.S. military spy plane on a provocative mission. Inside Soviet command, General Kornikov made the decision that would send shockwaves across the world. He ordered Osipovich to fire. The Su-15 pilot accelerated, lined up behind the Boeing 747, and at 3:26 a.m. local time, launched two heat-seeking air-to-air missiles. The first missile struck the tail section of KAL-007, crippling critical control surfaces and severing hydraulic systems. The second detonated nearby, sending shrapnel tearing through the fuselage. Inside the Boeing, passengers and crew felt a sudden explosive jolt. Alarms blared in the cockpit. The plane began descending rapidly, banking to the right. The pilot struggled to maintain control, but quickly realized the aircraft was mortally damaged. For the next 10 minutes, KAL-007 drifted downward in a slow, spiraling fall toward the sea. Some passengers likely survived the initial strike, strapped into their seats, helpless as the aircraft descended toward its final impact. At 3:38 a.m., the plane slammed into the waters near Monaran Island, killing all 269 people on board. In Moscow, the Soviet leadership initially celebrated what they believed was the successful interception of a U.S. spy aircraft. But within hours, the horrifying truth emerged. They had shot down a civilian airliner. The political implications were enormous. For the first time in the Cold War, the Soviet Union had killed hundreds of civilians, including Americans, during a period of already extreme tension. Fear rippled through the Soviet Politburo. Would the United States respond militarily? Was this the spark that could ignite World War III? In Washington, President Ronald Reagan was informed of the incident while intelligence analysts scrambled to confirm the details. When U.S. intercept stations picked up Soviet communication recordings, proof that the Soviets believed they were attacking a military aircraft, the crisis escalated even further. Both sides braced for the possibility of miscalculation. The public would soon learn that the world had been far closer to nuclear war than anyone realized. As news of the disappearance of KAL-007 spread across aviation networks, intelligence channels, and government circles, confusion reigned in every direction, and the hours immediately following the shootdown became one of the most chaotic and dangerous periods of the entire Cold War. In Tokyo, air traffic controllers reported a sudden loss of contact with the South Korean airliner. In Anchorage, flight dispatchers struggled to understand why the plane had not re-established radio communication. And in Seoul, families waited anxiously at the arrival gate without knowing that the aircraft carrying their loved ones had already been destroyed high above the sea. Meanwhile, American intelligence stations in Hokkaido and Alaska began intercepting fragments of Soviet military transmissions, confirming that an attack had occurred, prompting urgent alerts to the Pentagon and the White House Situation Room. Within minutes, top U.S. military officials realized that a Soviet interceptor had shot down an aircraft. What they did not yet know was whether it was a civilian jetliner or one of their own reconnaissance planes. The ambiguity was terrifying. If the Soviets had just downed a U.S. military plane, Washington would be forced to consider military retaliation. At the same time, inside Soviet Far East Military Command, conflicting reports created panic. Some officers continued insisting that the aircraft was an American spy plane. Others feared they had made an irreparable mistake by destroying a civilian Boeing 747. This internal chaos led to contradictory orders and delayed communication to Moscow. When the truth finally reached the Kremlin, it struck Soviet leaders like a hammer. They had killed nearly 300 civilians, including foreign nationals, Americans, and a U.S. congressman. The very idea that this could be interpreted as a deliberate attack terrified them. The Soviet Union was already under global scrutiny, with a worsening economy, internal dissent, and growing distrust from the West. Now they were facing an international disaster of unimaginable proportions. In the United States, President Reagan's advisors prepared for the worst. Memories of the Cuban Missile Crisis loomed large. Miscommunication between superpowers had nearly triggered nuclear war before, and the risk was even higher now. At NORAD, radar operators monitored Soviet missile fields for any changes in activity. U.S. bombers were placed on higher alert. Submarines received temporary combat readiness instructions. All of this happened before the world even knew what had occurred. When U.S. intelligence finally confirmed that a civilian airliner had been shot down, the global political landscape shifted instantly. The United States prepared one of the most extraordinary information offensives in Cold War history. Using intercepted communications, radar data, satellite tracking, and pilot recordings, the U.S. crafted a detailed timeline of the incident. They would soon reveal it publicly to prove Soviet guilt beyond any doubt. In Moscow, the opposite strategy took shape. The Soviet Union denied everything at first. The Soviet press released statements claiming that their military had no involvement. But then new evidence contradicted the denial. Radar tracking logs, pilot communications, and intelligence reports from Japan and the U.S. mounted quickly. Under mounting pressure, the Soviets switched tactics. They admitted their military had intercepted the aircraft, but insisted it was a deliberate U.S. provocation. According to the Soviet narrative, KAL-007 was a spy plane or a decoy intentionally sent through Soviet airspace to gather intelligence. They claimed the U.S. routinely violated their borders and that this incident was just another example of American aggression. But the international community did not buy it. The world began demanding answers. Family members in South Korea and Japan protested outside embassies. Newspapers ran devastating headlines. The Soviet image, which had already suffered from the invasion of Afghanistan, human rights abuses, and internal repression, collapsed even further. And then the United States made its move. In one of the most dramatic diplomatic broadcasts of the Cold War, U.S. Ambassador Jeane Kirkpatrick presented intercepted Soviet pilot communications before the United Nations Security Council. The tape was damning. It revealed the Soviet pilot calmly reporting that he had fired on the aircraft. It showed Soviet commanders giving the order to destroy it, and it confirmed that the plane had shown no hostile intent. Shock rippled through the international community. The Soviet Union had been caught, been lying in real time before the entire world. American intelligence also presented radar plots showing KAL-007's deviation from course, proving it was not executing reconnaissance maneuvers. The tragedy had been an accident amplified by Soviet paranoia and catastrophic miscommunication. But beneath the political drama, the human toll carried the deepest weight. Families learned they would never recover the bodies of their loved ones. Investigators found only fragments, small pieces of wreckage, clothing, and personal effects. Most of the aircraft had shattered on impact and sunk into deep, turbulent waters, making recovery nearly impossible. The emotional devastation in South Korea was overwhelming. National mourning ceremonies filled stadiums. Footage of crying relatives circulated globally. The grim reality settled in. This was not just a Cold War event. It was a mass human tragedy. In Washington, the Reagan administration saw an opportunity to strike at the Soviet Union's moral legitimacy. Reagan delivered one of the most famous speeches of his presidency, condemning the Soviets as a regime that shoots first and asks questions later. His words resonated globally and placed the USSR on the defensive. Yet behind closed doors, Reagan and his advisors were terrified. They knew how easily this could spiral into military retaliation, escalation, or misinterpretation. For days, both sides monitored each other's nuclear forces more closely than at any time since the early 1960s. U.S. early warning satellites watched for sudden missile activity. The Soviets heightened readiness in the Far East. Submarines tracked each other beneath the Pacific waves. In Moscow, Yuri Andropov, General Secretary of the Communist Party, lay in a hospital bed, increasingly paranoid that the United States was preparing to use the tragedy as cover for an attack. In the tense days that followed the destruction of KAL-007, the world found itself suspended between grief, outrage, and the terrifying uncertainty of what the United States and the Soviet Union might do next. And nowhere was the atmosphere more volatile than inside the Soviet leadership, where the highest-ranking officials struggled to reconcile the international condemnation they now faced with the rigid military doctrines and paranoia that had led to the incident in the first place. General Secretary Yuri Andropov, already severely ill and increasingly distrustful of the West, became convinced that the United States would use the tragedy as a pretext for political or even military aggression, and this mindset sent shockwaves through the entire Soviet chain of command. Intelligence officers were ordered to assume the United States was preparing for retaliatory strategic measures, while Soviet naval forces in the Pacific received new directives to monitor U.S. carrier groups more aggressively. Submarines, many of them armed with nuclear ballistic missiles, were instructed to remain undetected and fully battle-ready, deepening the sense of crisis. On the American side, however, the calculus was different. President Reagan and his advisors understood that a direct military response risked triggering uncontrollable escalation, especially given Andropov's failing health and increasingly erratic worldview. Rather than meet Soviet panic with military force, the U.S. decided to wage a massive information and diplomatic campaign, one that would box the Soviet Union into a defensive position on the world stage while avoiding steps that could push Moscow into a catastrophic overreaction. This strategy became evident when the United States released further evidence, including satellite photos and intelligence transcripts, that dismantled the Soviet claim that KAL-007 had been conducting espionage. The Soviet leadership was stunned again. The Americans were not only exposing their lies, they were doing it in a way that made the USSR look reckless, panicked, and dangerous even to neutral nations. But the crisis deepened further when it became clear that the Soviets had tracked the aircraft for hours, and had numerous opportunities to identify it as civilian. For many nations, this was proof not of Soviet miscalculation, but of systemic military dysfunction. Throughout Asia, Europe, and the Americas, the Soviet Union became the subject of widespread condemnation, with even typically cautious nations accusing Moscow of committing a crime against humanity. The Soviet leadership reacted to this pressure with secrecy and stonewalling. They refused to release black box data. They restricted access to the crash site. They accused the United States of manipulating evidence. But as these denials continued, their credibility collapsed. Meanwhile, families of the victims, particularly in South Korea and Japan, demanded answers. Vigils spread across Seoul, Tokyo, and New York. Many relatives felt anger not only at the Soviet Union, but also at the lack of immediate clarity from their own governments. In South Korea, the images of grieving families became symbols of national unity and outrage. For Japan, scrambling rescue teams to the crash region, only to find restricted access and no survivors, intensified anger toward the Soviets. And in the United States, the death of Congressman Larry McDonald, a sitting member of the House of Representatives, brought the tragedy straight into the heart of American political life. Members of Congress demanded retaliation. Some called for sanctions, others for military action. Yet the Reagan administration understood something crucial. KAL-007 was not just a tragedy, it was evidence of how dangerously close the world stood to nuclear disaster from misunderstanding alone. American military leaders knew that the Soviets had believed they were responding to a threat. They also knew that an aggressive U.S. military response could trigger further misinterpretation. In fact, declassified documents later revealed that the United States was deeply concerned about the possibility that the Soviet Union's command structure, already riddled with miscommunication and paranoia, might misread even normal military movements as preparation for attack. This concern grew even more urgent when intelligence analysts discovered that the Soviets had begun a strategic readiness review of their Far East forces after the shoot-down, a sign that they were preparing for the possibility of a U.S. strike. The danger was not just political, it was mathematical. A dozen tiny misread signals, an American carrier group moving into new waters, a communication outage, an incorrectly interpreted radar return, could create a chain reaction leading to global catastrophe. Meanwhile, inside the Soviet Union, discontent simmered beneath layers of censorship. Many citizens learned about the shoot-down through foreign radio broadcasts, which the government attempted to jam. The Soviet press covered the event only through carefully crafted propaganda that blamed the United States for using the airliner as a spy decoy. But even among loyal citizens, doubts began to spread. Why would a civilian airliner intentionally enter Soviet airspace? Why did the Soviet military take so long to identify it? And why were Soviet officials refusing to release objective evidence? Among Soviet scientists, military officers, and intellectuals, private discussions grew increasingly critical of the government's handling of the crisis. But in a tightly controlled society, these conversations took place only behind closed doors. No one dared challenge the official narrative publicly. For the officers directly involved, the strain was immense. Major Osipovich, the pilot who fired the fatal missiles, was instructed to maintain secrecy, deny responsibility, and avoid interviews. He later described experiencing a profound psychological burden, convinced he had done his duty, but haunted by the knowledge that he had destroyed an aircraft full of civilians. Other officers felt betrayed by the system they served. The chaotic communication failures, misidentifications, and contradictory orders had exposed a dangerous truth. The Soviet military machine was far less coordinated and far more paranoid than it appeared from the outside. In Washington, the crisis led to an unprecedented reassessment of U.S. military and diplomatic protocol concerning civilian aircraft. One major outcome was the acceleration of the GPS program. President Reagan announced that once GPS was fully operational, it would be made available for civilian use, specifically to prevent tragedies like KAL-007 from occurring again. This announcement marked one of the most significant long-term technological legacies of the Cold War. Yet the immediate aftermath remained tense. Soviet refusal to cooperate with international investigators infuriated the world. Their decision to bury information only fueled suspicion that they were hiding something worse. Meanwhile, the United States continued to release intelligence that contradicted Soviet claims, steadily eroding Moscow's remaining credibility. For the Soviet Union, this was a geopolitical nightmare. Their already strained relationships with Japan and South Korea deteriorated further. Western European nations issued harsh statements condemning Moscow. Even traditionally neutral countries questioned whether the Soviet Union could be trusted to maintain stability in an increasingly interconnected world. Andropov's government responded with anger and defensiveness, convinced that the West was exploiting the tragedy for political gain. But internally, many members of the Politburo saw something more troubling. The shoot-down had revealed deep cracks in the Soviet command structure and exposed the catastrophic consequences of their outdated doctrines. It also raised a terrifying possibility. If a civilian airliner could trigger such chaos, what would happen if real conflict ever erupted between NATO and the Warsaw Pact? The Cold War's most dangerous truth now hung in the air. Neither side fully understood the other's capabilities or intentions, and the margin for error in nuclear-age geopolitics was shrinking dangerously fast. As the shock waves of the KAL-007 tragedy continued to ripple across the globe, the Cold War entered one of its most psychologically unstable periods, with the shoot-down becoming both a symbol of Soviet paranoia and a catalyst for a deeper understanding of just how fragile the line between peace and annihilation had become. And nowhere was this more evident than in the months that followed, when tensions escalated to heights unseen since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the world unknowingly came within inches of nuclear war, yet again during NATO's Able Archer exercise of November 1983. The Soviets, humiliated on the world stage and terrified that the United States would exploit their mistake, became hypersensitive to any sign of Western military movement, believing that a first strike might be imminent. Intelligence agencies later revealed that the Soviet Union activated elements of Operation Ryan, their early warning system designed to detect signs of an American surprise attack, and began monitoring everything from increased diplomatic communications to minor shifts in NATO training schedules. The mindset inside the Kremlin grew darker, more defensive, and more convinced of American hostility than ever. Meanwhile, American policymakers interpreted Soviet defensiveness not as fear, but as aggression, mistakenly believing the USSR was adopting a more confrontational posture in the Pacific following the shoot-down. This misreading widened the gap between the two superpowers even further. Amid this atmosphere of suspicion, both nations continued enhancing their military readiness. U.S. carrier groups in the Pacific maintained a tighter formation. Soviet submarines shadowed trade routes more aggressively, and intelligence analysts on both sides monitored radar screens with hair-trigger anxiety, acutely aware that any perceived threat could spiral out of control. Yet in the midst of this geopolitical maelstrom, the human dimension refused to fade, especially in South Korea, Japan, and the United States. where families of the victims continued demanding answers and accountability. Their grief remained raw, their questions painful, and their frustration fueled by the Soviet Union's refusal to disclose flight recorders or release details about the crash site. In Seoul, thousands marched in protests calling the shootdown a mass murder and denouncing Soviet inhumanity. In Tokyo, nearly every major newspaper ran front-page exposés analyzing Soviet behavior, while Japanese officials privately complained that Moscow's secrecy had insulted the victims and obstructed international law. In Washington, the emotional and political weight of the tragedy crystallized in the halls of Congress, where the death of Representative Larry McDonald turned what could have been a diplomatic dispute into a constitutional-level outrage. Politicians across the spectrum condemned the Soviet Union, some even calling for military retaliation or severe sanctions, though cooler heads ultimately prevailed. Yet beneath the public anger lay a deeper fear. If a civilian aircraft could be shot down due to misinterpretation, what would prevent a nuclear missile launch under similar circumstances? This worry was not hypothetical. Soviet radar operators, spooked by recent events, became increasingly jumpy, and one such operator, Stanislav Petrov, would later prevent a catastrophic nuclear response by refusing to act on a false alarm. Petrov's decision, made only weeks after the KAL-007 tragedy, underscored a terrifying truth. The world had entered a phase in which human judgment was the only barrier between civilization and extinction. In the international arena, diplomatic fallout continued to mount. The International Civil Aviation Organization launched an extensive investigation that condemned Soviet conduct, while numerous countries implemented new air corridor safety protocols. The United States pushed for stricter airspace transparency agreements, though the Soviet Union resisted, fearing such measures would reveal military vulnerabilities. However, global pressure eventually forced the USSR to soften its stance. Years later, during Mikhail Gorbachev's leadership, the Soviets finally released the cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder. But even then, they attempted to spin the narrative to deflect blame, insisting the jetliner had acted suspiciously. Yet the information on the black boxes confirmed what the world already knew. KAL-007 had been a tragic navigational error, compounded by catastrophic misjudgment on the Soviet side. Still, for all the geopolitical embarrassment the incident brought upon the Soviet Union, it also served as a catalyst for badly needed reforms. Gorbachev, who came to power in 1985, recognized the enormous damage the shootdown had inflicted on the USSR's global reputation, and he later cited the tragedy as one of many reasons the Soviet system required transparency, modernization, and openness, principles that became the foundation of glasnost. Meanwhile, in the United States, the tragedy spurred investment not only in GPS, but also in renewed diplomatic engagement. Senior American officials realized something chilling. If the Soviets were willing to shoot down an unidentified aircraft because they couldn't distinguish it from a spy plane, then the potential for misunderstanding extended into every corner of Cold War conflict. This realization influenced Reagan's eventual decision to open negotiations with Gorbachev, shifting from confrontation to dialogue, even while maintaining economic and military pressure. The legacy of KAL-007 grew even more significant when the full geopolitical aftermath became clear. Analysts now agree that the shootdown was one of several key events that weakened the already strained Soviet economy by accelerating sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and loss of trade opportunities. It is also widely believed that the tragedy contributed to the Soviet Union's increasing psychological exhaustion. an internal sense of vulnerability that made maintaining the arms race and global influence far more difficult. For historians, KAL-007 stands as a turning point. It exposed the limitations of Soviet air defense systems, the dangers of rigid military doctrine, and the catastrophic consequences of Cold War paranoia. It also served as a harsh reminder that even a technologically advanced global superpower could make fatal mistakes under pressure. The tragedy revealed something even darker about the Soviet command structure. Fear dominated decision-making, and that fear pushed commanders to act aggressively rather than cautiously. In the years since, pilots, analysts, and Cold War scholars have continued dissecting the incident, seeking lessons that apply even to the modern world. Many point out that despite technological advancements, the core risk remains unchanged. Nerves, assumptions, and accelerating military technology still create environments where misinterpretation can trigger global consequences. In that sense, KAL-007 is not just a Cold War tragedy, it is a timeless warning. As for the site where the jetliner fell, the waters near Monaran Island remain largely undisturbed. Strong currents, deep ocean trenches, and harsh weather conditions prevent meaningful recovery efforts. Most victims' remains were never found, and the ocean became their unmarked grave. Today, memorials stand in South Korea, Japan, and the United States, reminding the world of the cost of geopolitical mistrust. For the families, the loss remains deeply personal. Children who never grew up, parents who never came home, loved ones who vanished into the night sky, victims of a conflict they never chose. In Russia, the story remains complicated. Some still cling to the old propaganda narratives. Others accept the reality of the Soviet mistake. But either way, the legacy of KAL-007 is etched forever into the Cold War's history as a moment when fear overshadowed reason, when secrecy outpaced truth, and when hundreds of innocent lives were lost because two superpowers saw each other not as people, but as threats. In the end, KAL-007 was more than an accident. It was a mirror reflecting the dark heart of the Cold War, a stark example of how easily humanity's fate can hinge on a misunderstanding, and a reminder that even in the quiet sky of a peaceful night, the world can come closer to disaster than anyone realizes.